Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us for the afternoon of the Transatlantic Symposium on the EU security and defense policy. I'm very happy that we are here now for the next discussion on Africa, which is also a theme on the strengthening the cooperation between the US and EU and also on support to the African peacekeeping. And we do have here a representative, Mr. Didier Lenoir from the European External Action Service, and also Mrs. Dory from the Department of Defense. And I do give now the floor to Mrs. Hicks, who's a distinguished fellow and also the chair of the Henry Kissinger, and a specialized, also having the distinguished career in the administration as well. So please, now the floor is yours, and I'm very happy that you accepted to moderate the session. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. I want to apologize in advance. I have a little bit of Washington allergies right now, so my voice is very low. And I apologize because I'm sure I will cough during this event. I'm so pleased today to have Didier and Amanda here with me. And I want to tell you a little bit about them. Their bios are in your packets, but I do want to give some discussion to their vast experience in this area that we're going to be talking about on African peacekeeping. First, Didier has 25 years of professional military and crisis management experience, Africa, but also to include the Balkans and the Persian Gulf. He has spent time at the staff level. He has spent time in crisis management structures and, of course, with the French naval forces as well. Very pleased to have you here to discuss your experiences with the EU to date. Amanda Dory, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs, is joining us with long experience in Africa, also previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, where, among other things, she worked on the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, for which she received a Presidential Rank Award. And so I want to thank both of you for being here today. I'm just going to frame up a few items, and then we're going to allow each of you to have some time to talk. I may ask a question or two, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. What I asked each of you to think about a little bit today in your remarks is reflect on some of the key challenges that we have in the security realm for Africa today, and what the transatlantic community is doing and can do to help meet them. I think another thing we will be very interested in is any lessons learned that you all have garnered over the years from Libya, Mali, ongoing or other prior peacekeeping efforts in Africa in which the EU or NATO have been engaged. And then maybe a little bit about the counter piracy operations off of the Horn of Africa and how we might use the experiences there in terms of transatlantic cooperation to inform efforts that we take on in the maritime domain in Africa going forward. So with that, let me turn it over to Didier first to kick off with some comments on his experiences with the EU.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe a bit less of a strategic vision than the one we had this morning. Even so, I do think that even so, Europe is today on the forefront. I mean, one should not neglect Africa. We were talking about counterterrorism. What's the point of having invested so heavily in Afghanistan if it's to let terrorists settle gently 1,500 kilometers from European coast? So there is also in Africa a strategic dimension that has to be taken on board when we consider these issues. Second point, I think that when we consider the way we are engaging with Africa in African peacekeeping, there is a tendency, I would say, some sort of a strategic shift. Instead of addressing crisis ourselves, more and more we would like to help others addressing the crisis themselves. I mean, it's a question of obviously sustainability. It's a question of local buy-in. But it also has its own challenges. I mean, it's more probably of a long-term perspective. And I would like to very rapidly go through 2 or 3 lessons learned that we have discovered through our engagement in Africa. I would say a fairly heavy EU engagement in Africa. Most of our military operations have actually taken place in Africa. Most of our training mission and the 2 military training missions that we have are in Africa. We are engaged today in DRC, we are engaged in Mali, we are engaged in Libya, we are engaged in Niger, we are engaged in Somalia, who are engaged off the coast of Somalia. We are also engaged financially with a large financial package to support the setting up of the African peace and security architecture. So we have done some, I would say, a lot of work and two, three lessons. The first one is that when you consider capacity building, if you are in that logic of indirect strategy, then you should have an inclusive approach. Drill does not suffice. Providing some training to some units does not suffice. It does not provide the end result that you're looking for, that is a national capacity that is able to address crises and tackle security challenges themselves. You need to look at equipment, you need to look at organization, you need to look at the legal, political framework in which the security forces are operating, and therefore, even so, you should be doing training. It needs to be complemented with monitoring, advice on more strategic issues. That's really a lesson that we have learned and that we are trying to apply. All our training mission are systematically accompanied by a monitoring, advising dimension. And it's not only about respecting principle for the sake of respecting principle, it's a condition for the efficiency of your action. Let me give you just one or two examples. When you are training a troop in Somalia, if you don't want the battalion or the units that you are training to just dismantle as soon as they are back in Somalia, then you need to find a way to make sure that they remain as units. And one of the ways to make sure that they remain as units is to make sure that they are paid. So you have to work on the payment, the salaries, human resource management system, and that's I will come back to that. Something we have worked on together with the US. Not addressing this inclusive, all this aspect of this inclusive approach could even be counterproductive, because if you are just providing training to troops that cannot then be deployed because they are lacking equipment or because there is no proper logistical organization, then the end result that you have is that you have in the street of the capital better trained troops. Not necessarily a result that is conducive to more stability. So that's really something that we should keep in mind. If our end objective is to have national forces able to address security challenges, then you have to make sure that not only they are trained, but they are able to actually perform what they are supposed to perform outside their capital or their training camp. There is a massive loophole in our system in that one. It's the funding of equipment. It's difficult for everybody. I mention it because it's a key challenge in my view. It's a key challenge because military will recognize the train as you fight principle. If you train people without their equipment, then the training is of limited use. If your troops are not able to be deployed because they have no equipment, then they are simply not able to perform what you expect them to do. So, and this is a difficult issue. One should, I mean, it's not the subject of this panel, discuss the question of the DACability and the OCD guidelines and the fact that you can't fund military equipment, even so there is no security without development and no development without security. This principle has not translated into concrete mechanism to help us provide the security services with the necessary equipment, and that's definitely something we will have to address on the EU side. Second key lessons learned, you need a very strong local buy-in and appropriation by local authorities. This is obviously essential for sustainability. A system that is imposed from the outside, will not last. We all know it. This will not be sustainable in the long term. The only way it is sustainable in the long term is if there is a real appropriation by the local authorities. So I come back, this calls for a very strong monitoring, advising component of any training effort. It calls for a political approach because it's a sensitive issue. You are very close to regalian functions, and you have to take that into account where you are discussing with your interlocutors. To be honest, and it's a condition for the efficiency of our action. Now, we need to find a proper balance between whatever objective you have defined for your training or support mission and the objectives of the local authorities. One thing you should, for instance, take into account is that by training troops, you do not necessarily want to give to one or the other party a tool that could be used to impose a military solution to a problem that you want to be solved by political means. So there is a fine balance that has to be struck when you are training and providing capacity building support to whoever, is to make sure that this is calibrated in accordance with your political objective and the way you want to engage in a given situation. Third lesson, in my view, partnership is essential. Partnership is essential because if you want to have this inclusive approach, comprehensive approach on capacity building, then usually the resources you need are far beyond the capacity of one single actor. And not only it's a question of one single actor not having all the necessary resources, it's also a question of being able to build upon the added value and the specific skills of the various actors. And this is what we have been trying to do. And I like to give maybe one or two examples. I mean, the first one that comes to my mind, because we are discussing about US-EU relationship, is the question of Somalia. When we were faced with a challenge on how we make sure that the TFG at this time would not be overthrown by the Shebab, then we came to the conclusion that there was a need to give to the TFG necessary capacity to control at least Mogadishu. And then we made, together with our partners, the US, the UN, the African Union, Uganda, a list of everything that has to be done. From selecting the people that had to be trained, vetting them, transporting them from Somalia to Uganda, transporting them in Uganda, equipping them, training them, return, monitoring upon return, making sure they are paid, making sure there is a proper payment system in place. And we sat down together with our partners and we just allocate the task in a very informal way according to whoever was able to do the various tasks. So this is essential because we ticked off all the tasks, and at the end of the day we had a system that was a fairly comprehensive one covering all of these tasks, and we end up with the result we wanted. So partnership is essential. It's not necessarily a very well formalized, organized partnership, but you need to be able to discuss with one or the other of the key actors in the region you are engaging in, so as to be able to gather all the necessary resources to achieve your final objective. This is also what we have tried to do in Mali, for instance. In Mali, for various reasons, we were able to engage before the US was able to engage because of legal limitation after the coup. We have engaged with the UN, and the same. We are trying to delineate tasks so as to make sure that we are not competing, and the other way around, we are building on the specific added value of the various actors. In terms of EU-US coordination, what does that mean? And then I would conclude there. First thing is that we need to identify areas of common interest, because we will not be cooperating for the sake of cooperating. We will be cooperating, and cooperation will be successful whenever there is, I would say, a real interest in the crisis that we want to address. So expecting that we will engage a dialogue with partners and convince them that they should engage somewhere just because it would be nice to cooperate with the EU or whoever will simply not fly. It's about resources. Resources are becoming something very rare today. So we have to make sure that we have a common real interest on the crisis we want to address. So what does that mean? That means that it calls for a regular dialogue on issues, on African issues, so as to identify the spot where actually our interests are converging, and we want to be able to address them together. Second conclusion, we need to be able to set up rapidly these joint ventures that I was describing. And that means that we need to be able to work together very rapidly. And again, it calls for a regular pattern of coordination, of drawing lessons learned from exercise where we have been working together, so as to be able to set up this cooperation mechanism, joint venture, whatever, as rapidly as possible. Finally, we need to be able to dialogue throughout the training or capacity building efforts, because we need to make sure that our vision are still the same. We need to make sure that our resources are still there and that we can continue. There is a lot of technical details that have to be sorted out. So we need to have also a regular dialogue during the capacity building effort, so as to make sure that we can actually deliver what we want to deliver. So that's what we need to do now. The way we should do it is a second order issue, to be honest. Whether we should do it completely informally or whether we should do it in a different way is a second order issue. My personal feeling is that even so, we shouldn't formalize too much the processes. There is a need to be able to engage in crisis management together on this issue. We need to have some sort of a basis, a conceptual basis, to be able to develop this sort of coordination mechanisms that I'm describing. And I mean, from a personal point of view, it's not necessarily an EU point of view, but from a personal point of view, I need that in that logic. There is probably a need also to revisit the EU-US Declaration on Crisis Management that has been agreed some years ago, that do not necessarily provide, in particular when it comes to joint venture in the field of military capacity building, do not necessarily provide the necessary basis. So that's what, in a nutshell, I have to say.
Very good, thank you. Dory.
Thank you, Kath, and to the organizers for giving us this opportunity today to engage specifically on Africa and African security challenges, of which there are many. And I thought I would start by talking a little bit about the underlying commonality, I think, between the U.S. approach and the EU approach, which is what leads to the type of collaboration that you were just going through, and just kind of assert it. And I would be glad to be challenged where people think that I am too swiftly saying that there is commonality. But I do see from the many interactions that we have with visitors who are here from the EU, with opportunities like the conference today, that we have very common views of the security environment in Africa, taking a holistic approach to security, that we see governance trends, we see eye to eye on those. We see eye to eye when it comes to demographic challenges, the impact of technology, the impact of violent extremism in terms of existing fragilities and undergoverned areas on the continent. So I think our analytic approach as we look at the security environment is very similar. So I just want to kind of say that and move on. Similarly, I think our interests are very similar when it comes to regional stability, when it comes to the prevention of atrocities on a massive scale, when it comes to countering violent extremism, when it comes to building partnership capacity. I think all of those interests are well aligned. There are some that are a bit different based on our geographic locations, respective geographic locations. So I think some challenges at times are more intensely felt in Europe than they are in the United States, but I would say that's an issue of degree, and there's not a big difference there. Another kind of geography issue that I would just mention is the importance to the U.S. of Europe when it comes to the kinds of operational activities that we engage in with respect to Africa from a posture perspective, that our access to various installations in Europe is critical then for getting us closer to any type of operational activity on the African continent. So, some distinguishing differences there, but I don't think they're substantial. I think the strategic approach on how we address the shared interests is also similar. We talked about building partnership capacity already. In the U.S., we have the formulation of a small footprint, discussion in terms of how small is small, but I think that is the same approach, generally speaking, for Europe, for the EU. I think we also share the focus on African leadership and enabling African leadership in response to the various security challenges, and that this is not a situation in any particular location where external parties should jump out in the lead and kind of drive responses, that it is really working with and through others that is the preferred strategic approach. So this, to me, is the kind of underlying backdrop that leads to the collaboration that we see time and time again. You've cited some of the instances already, but Somalia clearly is at the top of the list in terms of the many complementary ways that we are working to support the AU, to support the UN's unique role in supporting the AU, to support individual troop contributing countries in the region who are deployed as part of AMISOM, whether it's the salaries, whether it's training, whether it's equipping, whether it's advising, really doing our best to enable the response of the neighbors, and more recently and encouragingly, the government of Somalia itself, and the latest project, which is an enormous one, which is the establishment of an effective Somali National Army and other security services in Somalia. Not to mention the entire maritime domain, where we have the layered responses, the EU at Atlanta, the different task forces in the vicinity that have been operating so successfully for many years. So I think Somalia is a case study of the kind of recipe, in a sense, for success of enabling and supporting many others. You mentioned Mali as well. We can go into the details later. Libya, very much a work in progress, much more challenging. Central African Republic, especially kind of through the back end of last year, and then looking forward to the eventual transition to a UN mission in mid-September. That, again, has been kind of a variation on the same theme of enabling those who are willing to deploy and working with the AU, working with the UN on the architecture for a longer-term response. Many other places. What I'd like to do is maybe focus on a few challenges, opportunities, maybe some provocations to stimulate a dialogue here. One of the ones that is foremost in my mind is the issue of concurrency, and how much can be managed by all of the different actors involved, whether it is at the AU level and their ability to manage concurrent crises, whether it is the number that the EU is able to manage, the US is able to support, the UN itself. We have about 9, by our count, different UN peacekeeping operations underway on the continent at this point. The AU has 3 of its own that are a different category. Some of those will become, for example, the CAR one, as Mali did before it, become a UN operation in short order. And our approach seems to be to start out with those most willing to respond swiftly, support them. But there's a kind of handoff that we're seeing a pattern now with kind of initial regional response, typically that could be a regional organization, then migrating to an AU response, and eventually to a UN response. And so I think the issue of which institutions can manage how many crises at one time is a pretty critical one when we think about the strategic approach. A second question I ask myself is, in thinking about Africa and the role of external influences over time, and just maybe focusing on this century, because this is a story that goes back for many centuries, but the changing nature of external influences, the colonial era, followed by the Cold War, followed by 9/11, and now the Arab Spring. Kind of each has different characteristics to it, but I think as we look at the external influences now, in particular the jihadist ideology that is inflaming and infecting and kind of existing tensions and political divergences on the continent, I think it's worth a conversation. Is this more of the same, or is this qualitatively different than the role of external influences that we've seen in the past? A third area that I think is worth some conversation is the role of the BRIC For those who were here this weekend, there was a list of things to do away with in the Washington Post, and one of those was BRIC as a meaningful acronym. But I do think, kind of thinking about the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and their influence on the continent when it pertains to security is worth a bit of a conversation as well. At least three of those, the Brazilians, the Indians, and the Chinese over time have been contributors to peacekeeping operations on the continent. Russia's primary contribution has been in the arms sale category over time, not really in the peacekeeping or making endeavors. But I think it's interesting to, as we think about concurrency, to try to think about where the BRIC may be going forward. Two other quick points. One is the AU itself and its recent summit decisions that focused on kind of, in addition to the concept of having African standby forces for each region to be able to respond in the event of crisis or conflict, took the additional step informed by the events in Mali of focusing on the need for an immediate crisis response capability. And we pronounce that as an acronym as ACIRC. I don't know how it's pronounced elsewhere, but if I slip and say ACIRC, that's what I'm referring to. But I think as outside partners, kind of understanding how that can be enabled going forward, and even that there's still competing visions within the AU on kind of a longer-term standby force vision relative to rapid response capability. But I think that's very much something for EU, individual European countries, and the United States to work with the AU on how that vision is supported and enabled. And maybe the final of the kind of questions or big areas for exploration, I think a question to think through is with other competing events in the world that impact on Europe and the United States, whether it is Afghanistan and kind of transitions that are happening there and how that impacts on capacity and capability, whether it's NATO, whether it's U.S., to be in a position to provide additional support and responses in Africa. Similarly, Ukraine and recent events there, how that impacts on NATO, EU, individual European countries, United States, and again, capacity and capability to support security responses related to Africa. So that's probably enough for provocations. I would just conclude by saying I think that the strategic approach that we share works. There are signs that it works. You know, sometimes it can take a couple of decades before it works. If you look at some of my favorite examples now are the countries that were the recipient of external forces and peacekeeping and who have undertaken successful transitions to the point that they're exporting security in the form of being peacekeepers themselves, whether it's in West Africa with the Liberia on a very small scale at this point, or more substantially Sierra Leone. So with the passage of time that evolution has happened, or in Central Africa, both Rwanda and Burundi, for example, are substantial contributors now when it comes to contributions for peacekeeping operations on the continent. So I think there are some success stories we can point to, but many more challenges still underway. I'll stop there.
Well, I think you have both just proven that this is an extremely ripe area and probably deserving of its own entire conference, both in how well you laid out the commonality of the interests and the number of challenges still ahead and how we execute, what we choose to do and how we execute it. I'm going to ask just two questions, and I'll turn it over to the audience. The first is about the partners, the African partners. In your experiences, I'd like you both to give me your thoughts, reflections on what are the most important factors you've found for success in your partners. So, for example, is it their adherence to rule of law? Is it the the linkage between their political system and their military system? Is it the capability level of their militaries? What has been most promising in your experience that makes you think this is going to succeed? We can get this group trained up and ready, and they can become net exporters, if you will, of security. Let me let Didier answer first.
To answer very rapidly on this one, the first one is that I think when you're advising, when you're providing advice, you need also to back up this advice with concrete support. My experience of missions that were entirely focused on advice and monitoring is that you are very carefully listened to the first 2 months, politely listen to the next 2 months, and then no longer listen to. Because the advisor that is not providing any support to implement its advice is simply not listened to. That's the first point. So you have to be seen as, I would say, a global partner that is not only there to provide advice, but is really there to back you up with concrete support. Second point, I think, and again, this calls the question of the articulation, and this is what you said, between our support to the African Union organization or sub-regional organization and the support we provide to national system. We have been entirely focusing, not entirely, we have been mainly focusing our support to a regional or sub-regional organization. That is fine, but that does not suffice. If you don't have the necessary troops to organize an African Union operation, you can have the best possible concept and organization for the AU itself, you will have no operation at the end of the day. There is a strong difference between what has happened in Somalia, where you had real capacities put behind the African Union organization, and that's the reason why it has delivered some result, and what has happened in Sahel, where, for various reasons, we have been missing, I would say, a lead nation on the African side to take forward the envisaged AU operation. So, to put it in a different way, I mean, it's fine organizing symposium on the logistical concept of the Africa Standby Force. If there is no troop to implement that concept, you go nowhere. So, again, to answer your question, the African countries are expecting a real support in terms of capability. They want to see a result, and not only some conceptual work and not only some advice. I think this is key. They have to be seen as partners, and this is where you have to manage the tension between your own objectives and the objective of the host countries that are not necessarily the same, and this is where you have to have a frank dialogue on where you want to go, what are the limitations, and what are the constraints you have to manage.
Very good. Amanda, thoughts on this?
I think I agree fully with everything on Didier's list, and would just add political will, I think, is subsumed in what you were just talking about. But if you don't have that in your partner, you can have, and we do this routinely, we try to focus on, well, where are the most capable partners? Let's work with them. And the political will is not necessarily there for any number of reasons. And sometimes it has to do with who you are. So, you know, as U.S., perhaps we don't have traction for any number of reasons, but others may have traction. So the political will piece is fundamental from lessons learned that we have over quite a number of years. I think complementing the point that you made earlier as well, the willingness to engage in institution building in addition to accepting training and equipping. I have a colleague who's fond of saying, you know, kind of train and equip, that's really the bottom rung, and you only get so far if that's the kind of relationship that you have. It's quite transactional to have a host nation who's willing to work on institution building. Involves a deeper level of commitment. It involves being willing to have advisors come and, you know, kind of engage in great detail into the way you do your business and the way you run your institutions. And I think that's one of the, as we went through our own kind of lessons learned after the Mali coup, for example, that was one of the primary ones where we had done a lot of training and equipping, and much less when it came to kind of working with the security forces at an institutional level. So I think that's a second area. And last but not least, I think this is an area for improvement as well. You know, as external partners to continue to provide resources, and that's very important. But figuring out the linkage where the recipient nation or the host nation is also putting resources in addition to human resources, but financial resources into the areas where you're cooperating. I think that's something that we've started to build into some of our programming, but hasn't historically been there. And it reinforces a very unhelpful dynamic in terms of ownership and sustainment of activities over time.
Interesting. I have one more question for each of you. It's a little bit different for each of you. There's a theme. The theme is one that both of you alluded to directly or indirectly, which is the relative priority of African security, African peacekeeping as a subset of African security within the EU context and then the U.S. national context. So for Amanda, my question is, given the relative priority, how confident are you, or how do you make your best pitch inside the U.S. system for committing scarce resources to African security issues, African peacekeeping issues? And then for Didier, there are gaps in capabilities on the EU side. You can answer the same general question, but we also know on the EU side there are gaps in capabilities where the U.S. has at times been asked to step in, where we know the EU aspires to have those capabilities in greater numbers, whether it's ISR or LIFT, things of that sort. How confident are you that the EU will be investing in those areas? So maybe I'll start with Amanda.
Sure. I think one of the things that gets lost in the kind of press headlines about pivots to Asia or rebalancing and that type of discourse is the kind of practical realities of the way that engagements in Africa are resourced both at the State Department and within Department of Defense. And particularly at the State Department, those continue to be reasonably robust. And they are assisted through congressional support in some specific areas where, whether it is the continuing focus on countering the Lord's Resistance Army, for example, that had overwhelming congressional support and led to very focused and substantial resources for that mission, whether it's countering violent extremism, that is very well supported as a mission area. Not kind of specific resources at this point, but I would imagine it's not too far of a stretch when it comes to counter-poaching and some other issues. So there is more support than one might expect when it comes to the financial resources on the Hill. So kind of even as the kind of debate rages about, priorities region by region, I think that the reality of the engagement and the activities is that it's robust. It's not enough to solve everything we would like to, back to the concurrency discussion, but I would say that I think we are good partners both to Africans and to Europe when it comes to engaging in African security problems.
I'll try to answer your two questions at the same time. I do think that it's mainly a question of political will. Whenever there is a political will, and therefore whenever there is a political interest, then usually resources are there. Now, it's slightly more complex on our side because it's not about EU political will. It's about 28 member states having the same will at the same time on the same subject, and it's slightly more challenging. But let me just give you an example. I can't remember when it was, 2005-06, the crisis in Lebanon. We were planning an operation in Chad, if my memory is correct, and we were missing a few elements. And the launch of the operation was delayed for some weeks because we are missing 3 nurses, 2 medics, and very minor capabilities. Then the crisis in Lebanon suddenly happened, and the very same countries that were not able to find the 2 nurses and the 3 medics were able to find 2 mechanized battalions to go to Lebanon. So it demonstrates that it's about political will, and when there is a political will, the capabilities are there. Now, to answer your question on the capabilities, yes, we have some shortfalls. It would be better if we were to have more strategic airlift capacities, but I would say for the type of missions that we are considering in Africa, I do think that within the EU, we should have the necessary capabilities against if there is a political will. Now, again, speak freely of there, but that probably one of the problems when it comes to management by international organization is that the collective will might be a way to hide a lack of individual commitment. So the we will do it is a way to say, but I will not. So that's probably one of the challenges we have to manage, because politically it's very difficult to refuse doing something in Central Africa or elsewhere. Now, when it comes to committing national forces, it becomes a slightly different issue. And that's where it's probably slightly more complex for the EU. But I do think that, again, it's a question of political will, and at the end of the day, and for us, the question is to have a real political will behind our commitment.
Very good. Okay, we have time for a few questions. I see a microphone, microphones on both sides, excuse me, there we go. And I just ask, if you raise your hand, I can call on you and give your name and affiliation. We'll start right here.
Thank you. Peter Michael Nielsen, Danish Embassy. Amanda, you mentioned the new ACIRC, or what it is, the acronym will be on the new immediate reaction capability that the African Union want to establish. A number of nations have been sort of engaged in the establishment of the standby forces. What is sort of your own initial assessment of what this will mean to the sort of the commitment to the standby forces, and are these complementary initiatives, and will it detract? Obviously, when you have a new thing going, a lot of political focus, will it detract attention from the other things? What is your assessment? Thank you.
Our sense from outside is that both proposals have support right now within the AU, and they do compete with one another potentially in terms of political energies, in terms of resourcing to convert into actual capabilities, and that debate is still underway within the AU. There, as we understand it, a compromise coming out of the AU summit to continue to have support for the standby forces, even while bringing forward a new initiative. And the sequencing is not clear to us yet in terms of how the AU itself is thinking about it. So I think we, for now, are kind of keenly awaiting further signaling as to how the sequencing will move forward. We have for the U.S. side, we have a memorandum of understanding that was established, a framework between U.S. and AU about a year and a half ago, one of Secretary Clinton's last activities before she left office, and that's really given us an improved opportunities for engagement with the AU in terms of regular dialogues and advisors and things of that nature. So I think we'll continue to watch that space to understand what comes out in terms of sequencing, but we are looking at the various categories, planning support, intelligence and early warning support, training for troop contributing countries. We're very keenly interested in logistics and lift as an area that continues to pose challenges for the AU. So we can see many categories where we would expect to engage, but I think until the tea leaves are a bit clearer, we will continue to make those plans without moving forward on implementation.
Great. Any questions? There's one back here.
So I had to step out for a minute, so forgive me if you actually covered this a few minutes ago. We are observing an increasing trend, particularly in Africa, of international NGOs being targeted as the modern tool of Western colonialism, so to speak. And as the primary donors for most of these organizations, the EU and USAID and other organizations, are they doing anything currently to try and A, reverse that trend, and B, provide protection for those institutions in Africa, for instance, from the nefarious groups that would be interested in harming them?
don't know if either of you feel
Well,
that's your area.
that's an interesting question. I mean, that would deserve long, because you were talking about the NGOs. I'm not sure that they want to be protected, to be honest. I mean, whenever we have a debate with NGOs on the protection, you have immediately sensitivities about the independence of NGOs. They don't want to be seen as being protected. I mean, we have had this debate again with a number of NGOs in Central African Republic. I mean, they simply don't want to be protected. I remember once an NGO complaining about, because we were using the same translators and them, and this was putting at stake their independency and therefore putting them in danger. I mean, the very same guys were at the next occasion when we discussed complaining about not being protected enough whenever there was a raid of rebels in the very same region. But so when we are deployed somewhere, yes, obviously when we have a protection mandate, we protect everybody, including NGO, but there is a more fundamental debate on the question of independence of NGOs, and most of them don't simply want to be seen as having anything to do with the forces that are deployed. That's usually the answer we get.
You want to add anything on that?
I think my answer is similar. From a DoD perspective, we are not in the receipt of requests for assistance or protection coming from NGOs, international NGOs. If I had a USAID colleague here, I imagine there is some kind of dialogue there in terms of how you support the security of contractors and subcontractors. But for independent NGOs, my sense is, there's a desire to remain as independent as possible.
Okay, we started a few minutes late, so I can take one more question if there's one. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Miguel Ferreira da Silva. I'm with the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Director Lenoir, just one question. It wasn't clear for me when you spoke about a possible joint venture for cooperation mechanism and the need to develop the conceptual basis for crisis management and for common action. If you were talking about the European Union within itself, or the cooperation between the European Union and the United States. And this for me is vital, because if it is the latter, maybe NATO can have a response to that. Because as you know, there are instruments, namely the centers of excellence, that do exactly that think, rethink the conceptual basis so as to create doctrine, one that could be shared across the Atlantic. So could you please comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I misexpressed myself. I mean, I was not after a doctrine. I was after some sort of a framework that we could use whenever we need to engage together on a given crisis. So if it exists somewhere, fine by me. We'll use whatever exists somewhere. But it needs to be fitted to what we want to achieve. What I'm after is being able to discuss with, and this is what we are doing, but being able to discuss systematically with the US so as to analyze spots where we might wish to engage together. Then being able to discuss very rapidly to set up the type of joint venture that I was describing very rapidly so as to be able to deliver effect on the ground as rapidly as possible, and then have a setup to be able to continue this dialogue throughout the process. I mean, when we were working in Somalia, we had discussion on a number of battalions that we wanted to train. Should it be 4, 6, 8? This is the type of discussions that we need to have. And we need to have an organization. So it's not that much about doctrine. It's about creating a framework, a setup where we simply can discuss, we know each other, we know our own limitation, etc., so as to be able to deliver the effect on the ground. It could work informally. It has worked very informally in Somalia. My experience is that some sort of formalization of this informality could help whenever you have to act under some pressure. So that's what I was describing. So it's not that much about doctrine. It's about concrete organizational work so as to make sure that whenever we have to do something together, we're able to do it.
Didier and Amanda, you've been very generous with your time, and as I said, this is a very rich topic. I appreciate you introducing it, and I'm sure there are many more opportunities for you to work together and for this community to work together to improve EU and US and collective capabilities for African peacekeeping. So please, if everyone can join me in thanking the panelists.